my ability to write, I think, started with the need to perform in the Army, especially. I was an actor, and I had wonderful writers writing for me. I had Claire Booth Luce and William Shakespeare, and I didn't have to do much writing. But once I got the idea that I did 1 year at a place called Alabama Acres, which was an adult camp, and it was a review form. And Bernie Hearn was the main comedian there, and I was this straight man, and I saw how sketches were put together, and it intrigued me. So when I got into the Army, they weren't going to mount As You Like It or Taming of the Shrew to let me act. But there was a microphone in a rec hall, and I always had the ability to tell a joke. I could really tell a good story. I could do the Sam Lapita stories when I was young from Lou Holtz. And I had an ability to make people laugh, but I never wrote anything. You would steal. You'd hear a joke, you'd repeat it. Then I got to be a good embellisher, and that was the beginning of writing. When I'd hear a 4-line joke, I would tell it as a long story and add things. I always thought I was lying, because I said, when I was very young, he didn't really tell it to me that way. I'm adding to it. But in my head, I said, I'm lying. This is not the way it happened. Or when I'd embellish a story that happened to me, I was a good embellisher. And I think that's what writers are. They embellish. The Sid Caesar Show was really my college. I came on as an actor. Max Liebman had seen me in a show called Alive and Kicking, and they needed somebody to interview Sid, doing one of those stand-up interviews. And I came on to just do that. And the first 3 weeks of the show, I was in the hall waiting for the writers to come up with the thing, and then they'd invite the actors in. And I wasn't used to that kind of behavior. I'd always been not a writer, but I'd written my own material in the Army. I did my own stand-up material. I did some sketches in an Army show. So I always what my wife called a washerwoman, someone who butts into things. So I felt very uncomfortable out in the hall. There were 2 writers' rooms. One was Max Liebman's office. The other writer's room was the men's toilet. And they used to split up. Now, Lucille Callan, the only writer on the show, was always in Max's office because she didn't want to go to the men's toilet. So I was in the hall waiting. It was at the city center in New York. That's where they had our office. Max had his offices. And in the third week, I was in Max's office where we all congregated to hear the material that was written in those first 2 days. And that's where I got my first little foot in the door, or a big foot in the door, because I knew when I came on the show that I would never be able to use my ability to double talk, which I did in my act. I did French and Italian double talk. And Sid was the master and is the master. Nobody's ever done double talk languages like he had. And I said, well, I'll never be able to use mine because mine is a cut below his. But I got the idea. I said, why don't we do a French movie? We all used to go see French movies, Italian movies, and Japanese movies. And together, we'd always go, in the first 3 weeks, no, but from then on, we knew, when we said, we had all seen Japanese movies and foreign movies, not in concert. So when I said, let's do a French movie, and they said, how are you going to do a French movie? We had done silent movies, we had done at that point, we hadn't done many takeoffs of big movies yet, American movies. And they said, how? And I got up, and I went to Sid, and I started to sell him some cigarettes or something in double talk. And immediately we had this conversation. We got into a fight, and they said, great, great. And Imogene said, I don't know how to do that. I said, well, we'll write it out for you. We'll write out the double talk. So that's the week I got into the writer's room. That was the most important moment for me, that I had the guts to get up and say, let's do this. And Max Liebman says, okay, you're in the writer's room now. So I was a writer without portfolio. I was what they call an effing actor. In the original writer's room was Mel Tolkien, Lucille Callan, and Max Liebman, Sid, and then Mel Brooks. He was not a writer with portfolio either. He was working for Sid on a petty cash basis. And then the second year, he said, I don't want to work for from Sid's pocket. Max used to pay him from petty cash after that. And I think the second year, he got a real salary. But he was a big contributor. And the second year, I think we had Joe Stein, who left to do Plain and Fancy. But he had done 2 years, I think, before he became renowned on Broadway, and you know, Fiddler on the Roof and Zorba the Greek, and everybody gave him his things to adapt, including myself. We did Enter Laughing from a book I'd written. So watching these guys work, listening to Mel Brooks, listening to Mel Tolkien and Tony Webster, Aaron Rubin, Larry Gelbart. You know, it's funny, Woody Allen's always mentioned, but I was never with Woody. Woody came in the 9th year when they did 4 specials. He was 18 years old, but they always put him in with Mel, and it always disturbed me a little chronologically. He was with Sid, but he did like 4 shows for him in the 1959. But he wasn't in that, what we call the melting pot, well, not the melting pot, the hot pot, I don't know what you call it, of the, I don't want to call it the golden age, because that's a name that somebody gave it. I don't call it a golden age. I call it the age where we all made a living. There was a typewriter there, and a writer would get, one of the writers would get up and sit and write his type and take it out and throw it down on the floor, and somebody would come and pick it up. That was the game, would pick it up to see what he had started. And it was always, he lusted for her, you know, it would be a sex novel, somebody, unfinished novels. Yeah. And I think the best one I ever remember was Mel Tolkien writing, there was a title, he wrote and he threw it down and we picked it up, the Mel Tolkien version of the St. James version of the Bible. That was a big thing to chew on. Right. But that was like the beginning of all us wanting to write. Neil Simon was in the room and Doc Simon, and we all played that game. Mike Stewart, who did Hello Dolly and Bye Bye Birdie and Candide, he was our typist then. And when Aaron wasn't really only a typist, neither was he. But what happens when you're a typist, you became the arbiter. You became the one with the selectivity. I don't like that joke. Wait, why aren't you typing? It's because I don't like the joke, you know. There would be a lot of that going on. We honored Sid's ability to choose and select. I mean, he would have a fake gun, and when he did have a gun collection, but he never brought a gun to it. But when a joke would fly in the air, Sid would look around, the joke was flying and go, you knew it wasn't a good joke. What happens, the real writing happens when you're lonely in a room. What happens is you learn to do it, you learn how it can be done their way. Because I was called a friggin' actor so many times, and what do you know, you're a friggin' actor. By the way, we had a lot of arguments about jokes. Everybody was fighting for their joke to get in, but everybody knew when there was really a joke that belonged in, nobody would fight for it. It's when they were, my rotten joke is as good as your rotten joke, you'll fight for your joke. But I remember, this is my development. Everybody develops differently. When I was in the Army, before I became a member of Special Services, I was a teletype operator, and we learned to type. And one day, there was nothing to do in the office. There was a typewriter, and I wanted to see if I still remembered how to type. And I would type badly, you know, a lot of mistakes, a lot of X's. And I remember going in a room and writing plays, just the cast of characters. I'd sit down and write cast of characters. That was an offshoot of reading a lot of Benchley. Benchley had a lot of these fake plays, the Meistergenossenschaft operas and plays, where he'd have a cast of characters in a short play. And I decided to make my cast of characters. And in the cast of characters, you describe who they are, and it becomes a beginning of a play. You can see this is the fun, the heir to the throne, the person who's killed that person, you know. And I wrote a series of these, like dozens. Every day I'd write one. And that was the beginning of my writing, alone. And then I'd bring them in and show them to the guys, and they'd laugh. They said, what is this? That's the beginning of a play. A live show to us, to the actor, meant that when you finished the sketch and the Esquire boot commercial came on, you had exactly 1 minute to get into your next costume, unless, thank goodness, Max Liebman or whoever was producing the show made sure there was a song number in between 2 sketches, but it didn't always work out. Sometimes there would be an opening sketch and there would be another sketch soon after that. So very often you wouldn't finish dressing. Sid once came on stage in a gladiator's leggings when he was supposed to be sitting on a park bench, you know, because he couldn't, or he forgot or made a mistake. But live meant if a piece of scenery fell down during the show, it was down. And Max Liebman said, fellas, if anything like that happens, don't worry about it. There's nothing you can do about it. Just go on with the show, walk over the scenery. But live meant that in 90 minutes, the show was done in 90 minutes, and it was done in 90 minutes. If there was a mistake, there was no cut tape, we'll start again, and you didn't wait. An audience who came to see a Saturday night show at the Big Center Theater or the International Theater or the Al Jolson Theater, those are the theaters we used, would be there for 1 hour and 45 minutes. There was a warm-up before we started, and I used to do the warm-up, by the way. I got $35 extra for doing a warm-up, which was telling the audience where to look. We had one big monitor, after the first few years we had that, the Center Theater. But for the most part, they were looking at the stage and watching live actors work in a theatrical situation. Before the Dick Van Dyke Show, I had never written first, it was never written situation comedy. I'd written the novel in 1958, and then when the show closed for me, the Sid Caesar show shut down in 1959. In 1960, I wrote for Dinah Shore with Charlie Isaacs. I wrote her variety show, our variety show, Charlie and I was also still an actor. I was every week, I'd be every other week I was the not so special guest star. It would be Bill, the not so special guest star, Carl Reiner, because I was on every other week. But that's the only writing I did. Now, because the review form was dead, it had just died, the review form with sketches and songs, it changed into a Perry Como show with just songs, no sketches. For a long time, there were, until Saturday Night Live, and, oh no, Carol Burnett came along, there were no sketch really shows, reviews for him. And I was offered a lot of situation comedies to Possibility. And my wife and I read them, and they're not very good. And she's the one, in her infinite wisdom, said, you know, you could write better than this. And I always wrote, I didn't write anything but Enter Laughing, really, that existed as an entity. And I never forget where I was. I was 96th Street and the East Side Highway on the FDR Drive. And I was thinking, what can I write about? And I actually said to myself, what piece of ground do you stand on that nobody else stands on? Everybody stands on a piece. Like, we're all in this room now, there are 5 of us in this, we're all have different experiences. I see 4 people, you're looking at 1 person. You see books behind me, I see a lamp and a window behind me. So we're all standing on different pieces of ground, even 2 kids in the same house and not sitting in the same chair or the same bed. I heard somebody say that. It wasn't but I heard it in one line, and I kept. And I said, I was a writer. I was actor, writer on the shows. I said, that's a good thing. And I said, I lived in New Rochelle, and I came to work every day, and that was pretty crazy, that room. I got the idea, and I said, I got it. And I didn't even think about it. As soon as I said I got it, I knew I could write it. I went out to Fire Island that summer. Right after that, I was on my way to Fire Island a week later, and I sat in my room, and I said, I'll write one for myself. And I wrote it was called Head of the Family. It was a guy who lived in New Rochelle who had, and we were 7 writers in the room. I was 7 writers in television. They're not going to pay 7 people to write, so I'll have myself, be the head writer, and it'll be 2 other writers. I'll get somebody a little like Mel Brooks, which was Morty Gunty, Sylvia Miles, a woman writer like Lucille Callan, and Selma Diamond, combination. And I did a pilot with Barbara Britton in New York, and I said, I'll never leave New York, and didn't sell. It was good enough. I mean, it was good enough to be considered. It was like on the edge. And that year, Horses and Guns sold. I think only 1 situation comedy sold, and that was Love and Marriage. I remember this very clearly. But when I was in Fire Island, I said, if I'm going to act in it, I better have a Bible for other writers. So I better write another show. I'll write a pilot, and I'll write another show. Every 4 days, I wrote another show. At the end of 6 or 8 weeks, I had 13 shows. I remember in this little room in Fire Island, I type away, and I remember people throwing stones at my window, say, what are you fucking, writing? What are you writing? It's summertime, you make us all guilty. A lot of writers in Fire Island. But I was working as an actor. I mean, as a writing for myself as an actor. At 2 o'clock, I'd stop. But I ended up with 13 shows. And I didn't know it was unusual. I just said, I was being pushed by the fact, oh, we got to do a show, and how am I going to write and act? I better have a lot of help at the beginning, and also to show writers who these people are, because you're not going to say, oh no, we didn't do that. I'd say, well, here, read these, you can see that. I was going to give it to writers really and say, now for the next
With those days it was 32 shows or 33 shows, so I knew there were going to be 20 shows I couldn't sit and write. When we did the Dick Van Dyke Show, which started out as, you know, all head of the family that I did, we recast everything. We recast everybody. Yeah. You don't want to fail again and say, you did it again, you made the same mistake. So Sheldon, who is really, I love Sheldon. He's my pedant. He's a guy who told me I was going to be a producer, and I says, I'm going to produce the show. How do you do that? He says, well, I can tell from your writing that you're a producer. I says, how could you tell that? He says, well, you said everything that has to be done, where they're thinking, where they're walking, where they're looking. He says, that's producing. You know, you didn't leave it up to somebody who said, hello, hello, you know, just that. I was all very well, where they're going to walk to, out of the room, into the, he says, that's, anyway, so I walked after Sheldon because I'm a good actor. I impersonated Sheldon, except I didn't use the way he talks. I talk like I talk. But really, Sheldon made me the producer. And Rosemary Rosemary was Sheldon's idea. He's always said he wanted to use Rosemary in something. He told her for a dozen years, I'm going to find the right thing for her. And he said to me, I got the girl for you, Rosemary. I knew her as baby Rosemary. I hadn't seen her do many things. She came in the room and I said, this is unbelievable. And Rosemary said, you know who you should have for the other writer? And I was thinking, I got to get a young guy, because I was thinking of Mel Brooks, who was, when we met, he's 4 years younger than me. I was 24 or 5, and he was 21. I said, I want a young guy. And she said, Maury Amston. I said, oh, my God, Maury. He had that club in New York, and I used to go there and watch this guy for 3 hours, the Human Joke Machine. I said, that's a great idea. I said, so, you know, because there was always on a staff, there was always a head writer or a writer who was angry because he wasn't the head writer, because he was older than the head writer, but the head writer had something else. So I said, that's a good mix, but it wasn't my idea. It was Sheldon's idea. No, it was Sheldon's idea to get Rosie, and Rosie's idea to get Maury. Alan Brady. Yeah, so it wasn't Sid. It was a combination of what I'd heard about Jackie Gleason, who never spoke to his writers, which was an abomination, we thought. I mean, he was a brilliant performer, but he treated the writers like they should be there. But Sid loved his writers. We lunched and dined almost every day for 9 years. We never didn't have lunch together. And he would never speak to his writers, and Marvin Marks and Lenny Stern, a few others, would slip their material under his door, and he'd come and rehearse on Saturday after Art Carney and Audrey Meadows or Bert Kelton, whoever it was. They'd stage it, and then he'd walk around a table and follow him. That's it. So he was one of those guys. And Milton Berle with the whistle and the thing, who scared everybody, who was a pussycat, really. But in those days, he was like, so I tried. And Phil Silvers was in my head, too. Not Phil Silvers the person, but Phil Silvers the Top Banana, you know, in Top Banana. So I try to write about a guy who was all of those people, who was a force, an offstage force. And, you know, you always have to have that conflict coming, somebody you're frightened of. I mean, otherwise you don't have comedy. Comedians are all little guys who have somebody scaring them. It was very helpful to me that we did the show of shows and Caesar's Hours and Caesar Presents in front of a live audience. And the fact I was an actor for years before that on Broadway, I'd done 3 Broadway shows and musicals, I was always used to, I was in theater, so I knew about an audience. So we almost needed an audience to do the work that we knew how to do. And so when Sheldon Leonard told me that it was in front of a live audience, that comforted me, because this one-camera show frightened me. And I learned, while we're doing the 3-camera show, the biggest thing I learned about 3-camera shows is that they're better than 1-camera shows for comedy, for one reason: the responsibility of the writer. You send an actor up in a plane and it doesn't fly, and you tell him, don't worry, there'll be a laugh there with a machine. And it makes the writers lazy. Instead of, I used to say, my God, when I've been at home, I said, no, I can't, I got to get a better joke here, because they're not going to laugh. Instead of saying, it's good enough, settling. I think writers in one-camera comedy shows settled much more easily, because they didn't have actors looking at you and say, this is what you want me to say in front of an audience. Having a live audience made the big difference. The 3-camera thing, which I think they give Desi Arnaz credit for, which is saved our lives, saved the lives of performing comic actors. Danny Thomas, I mean, he came alive when he walked out there and heard that that audience. We all used the laugh machine, including the 3-camera shows, but we used it for a different reason. We never, in all of the years that we did the Dick Van Dyke Show, ever took a laugh where there wasn't. If we played a scene and we thought the line was funny, and we left it in the script and in the performers' mouths, and there was no laugh, we'd leave it at that. It made everything else kosher. It made the real laugh. When somebody really laughed, they'll say, well, they're not faking. You know, they didn't laugh at that. And by the way, sometimes they don't laugh in an audience, they laugh at home, and vice versa. The only thing I found against the audience laughter is that it was intrusive. Because you're in a party situation with 300 people, there are more laughs than there would be in a living room with 3, 4 people watching a show. It's rare that you laugh out loud in a living room. So that was intrusive. And we've done this many times. Sometimes there was such a big laugh. It just went on and on and on, because sometimes a laugh in an audience is because of the thing you've written, but it's also sometimes exacerbated by somebody with a funny laugh, and they laugh at that person's laugh, so the laughter keeps growing. And sometimes an actor will build on the laugh by doing a little take, or you know what, and it throws the whole show out of kilter. It throws the whole scene out of kilter. Laughs usually don't, but sometimes they. And we have actually remember saying, cut away and take the middle of that laugh out. And sometimes we do it because the show was too long. But most of the time it's because the audience at home wasn't there to see that little moment that made that extra big laugh. It's not on camera. The use of Dick's physicality was something that we paid attention to at least once every 8, 9 shows. We said, we got to do a show where Dick does some of his brilliant pantomimic stuff more often if we could find it. They don't come as easy as words, you know. You find situations, silent movies, that's all they thought of. So, but Dick always said, I was born many years too late. He should have been in silent movies. We did I wrote a show called A Comic for him. But about Dick being drunk, there was a scene where Dick came home drunk but was so frightened of his wife. It was a sketch that Aaron Rubin wrote for him for a show on Broadway called Two on the Aisle or something. I'm not sure, Boys Against the Girls, I'm not sure. And I saw that and I said, we got to use that. And we used that in the pilot to show an example of the comic ability of the people. And it was a party situation, which we had many times. Imogene Coca would throw parties in the old shows. And and if there were some people from the networks there, we're all asked to do a little something. We all entertained. And the wives, after a number of years, hated it. They said, we're sitting around listening to you guys, you know, instead of interplay. So the wives didn't like it. So I wrote, the basis of the first show was based on entertaining people at a party. And we used that sketch that existed, that Dick had done in a show. And then years later, I said, gee, that's such a wonderful gimmick. A guy is totally drunk, but he's so frightened of his wife. When his wife talks to him, he sobers up. And how the heck can I use that again? Years later, I thought of one where I went to see Collins, the hypnotist. I said, oh, God, if Dick were hypnotized, and when he heard a bell, he'd sober up. He was drunk when he says, you know, he would get drunk by suggestion. And we did that, and it was one of our most successful shows, even more successful than another one, because the whole show was based on every time I heard a bell a day later, because he was not in the room when the spell was taken off by the hypnotist. He happened to be in another room drunk, and he didn't hear the spell taken off. Bless Sheldon Leonard, your Sheldon Leonard, yeah, right, our Sheldon Leonard, the one. He had a wonderful attitude toward writers. He knew that the play is the thing. And he always invited writers in. He made teams. He said, this guy is good, he's a funny guy, but he doesn't have any idea of what story is or what real relationship, but he can throw a joke. He put people together. And we used to have, and I don't think they do that anymore, and I loved it. We'd sit in a room, there was a Belson and Marshall, a Persky and Denoff, and Idelson and Bobrick, and we'd all say, they'd come in, and for the most part, in the shows that I consider good shows, there's usually one reality. There's somebody who thought of that show, and it's their show, the Gary Goldbergs and the Larry Davids, and the shows that work, and the Roseanne. It's Roseanne's reality, somebody's reality. But And nobody can know what your reality is. You have to. Frank Tarloff was the best, gave me the best line. I said, "It's got to be real." He's, "Who's real? You're real or my real?" I said, "My real." I don't know you're real. So you got to. So when writers come to write for a show, they have to put their reality, in tow, in check. And what Sheldon would do would have these, and I learned it from him, and we all did it after that. We bring 3 or 4 teams together, 2 or 3 teams together, and say, give us springboards. In other words, Laura loses her wedding ring, or there's dozens of, how many dozens of stories? There are not that many, but the variations on the theme. There are 9. How many notes on the diatonic scale? But how many variations you can do with them? Same thing with writing. But what I loved was that if a guy didn't have an idea, but we knew he's a good writer, we'd say, let's pitch, let's come up with ideas. I would come, they would come. I'd have a list of things I was going to do for myself. And if a writer came and we couldn't get an idea, I went to my list. I said, okay, here's a thing I was going to do. And I always knew when I gave away one of my ideas that whatever came back, I was going to be able to make a show out of it. And it happened many times that I tried young writers who didn't have it, and I took it back and rewrote it, kept their names on it. That was another thing that Sheldon did. We didn't have any arbitration. If a guy gave us a script and it didn't work, we threw it out, wrote another script, their names on it, no problems. That happened a lot. The Writers Guild never knew about that. We knew about that because it was Sheldon's edict. We don't bother, they came, they did their work. We goofed. We took the wrong guy. Don't blame him. They couldn't find your reality. That was it. But what they did is that Sheldon would, and all of us, we had these 3 teams, and nobody would leave without an assignment. And sometimes it was Gary Marshall who said, here's an idea, and I don't know, and somebody, and he had an idea, and we all right, give it to him, And there was no ego about that. There was, I'm sure, but they were to subdue their ego. And it was Sheldon's technique. I don't know where he found it, but that was, I don't know if any other lot had that. Well, it couldn't be otherwise. If the show is from your gut, it has to be that way. And until I found Persky and Denoff in the third year and the 4th year, they became story editors. See, the first year, the second year, I was very lonely. I was my own story editor, and I wrote the first 20 out of 30. The first 40 out of the first 60 shows I wrote myself. And the reason I wrote them myself is I found it difficult to rewrite other writers in 4 days. I would do it in 8 days. My own show I could write in 4 days. So that's why I kept writing. And not because, and when I won an award as the best writer, I said, I'm not the best writer. I'm the best writer for this kind of thing. Of course, it's me. I was very aware that other writers who I admired, but they didn't write what I wrote. They didn't know my people like I knew my people. So I stayed very close. I worked harder on the rewriting, much harder on the rewriting than I ever worked on my own shows. And that's why I stopped giving shows out in the first year or 2 until I got 2 guys who, this was interesting, very interesting. And it's a good lesson to writers. Persky and Denoff were 2 guys who worked in radio. They were really talented. They worked, on New York radio shows as a team. They came up with ideas. They're very full of ideas. And they loved the Van Dyke Show. In the second year, they sent me a show. My agent, who's also my manager, my nephew, George Shapiro, he said, these guys are wonderful. I'm bringing them out to do the Steve Allen Show. They're really funny guys. And I met them, Persky and Denoff. They were hilarious. They're wonderfully funny guys. And they wrote a spec show that was so wrong. It was Battle of the Sexes. It was old world. There was a kind of television where antithetical husbands and wives are always fighting. And my husband and wife were 2 against the world. My wife and I liked each other. We fought, but we always knew there was no way these people were going to leave each other. And this was all this kind of funny stuff. And I said, gee, they didn't get it. And I said, George, I can't use it. And you're not asked, and I didn't ask for a spec script. They threw it at me. This is a Writers Guild. Scripts that came, and I never took them because we knew them. But Sheldon said, send them back, send them back. So this one was brought in by my nephew, and it wasn't good. The following year, George said, you ought to see Persky and Denoff again. I said, no, I can't. He says, they've watched the show for a year. They know what you were talking about. They listened. When you said that, they took it to heart. They watched it for a year. And they want to come and pitch an idea. And I said, I can't. I said, I'm not going to say no to 2 guys who did a spec. I don't want to say no again to them. He says, listen to the idea. They came with the idea that they pitched it to me. Oh God, salvation. It was the show where Dick and Mary think, Rob and Laura think they got the wrong baby because they got the prunes and somebody got the flowers. Peter's Petri, 308, 303, the 8 closed up an 8, and it looks like a 3. You know, all those. And it was one of the best shows we'd ever done. And they were there, and I said, fellas, this is great. You can do more for us. And they said, can we hang around? I said, I'll give you an office next door. And that was what made them understand the show. They learned who the people are, they learned who the actors were, and they stayed with me for that whole year. I think they did 3 or 4 shows that year, but they were right next door. I came in every day, and I said, what do you got? And we'd say, no, you can't do this. Yes, you can do this. Oh, this is great. This is shit. And the 4th year, they became the story editors. And I think if they hadn't come there, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. You'd be doing a memorial for me, you know. What we did, and it was very comforting that if we made a mistake, we could go and pick it up later and redo it. Yeah. Now something is happening that is, and I just did a show called, they asked me to come back and do Alan Brady on the Mad About You. And when I met Paul Reisman, told him I was on some benefit, and I met him, and I said, I just love you and Helen. You're just the most delicious people on television. Would you do one for us? I said, I really don't want to do television anymore. I said, it's a young man's business, and I had my 15 years of live television. I said, and I was asked to do, you know, things on other television shows. I said, no. And I said, I don't think so. He said, suppose we come up with an idea. He really came up with an idea I couldn't resist. He says, we don't want you to play a part. We want you to play Alan Brady. We want you to be Alan Brady. We want Alan Brady. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. He told me it's the idea of a documentary. And it was a perfect idea for Alan Brady, the shit, to come back. But what I found out, they took what Desi Arnaz and then Danny Thomas and all those shows on the Desi lot, the Dick Van Dyke Show, and they've taken it to the point where we never figured. We always figured that we were working for the audience in the studio, that we gotta do the show right and we gotta do it on time, and we very seldom fumbled. If we did fumble and make a mistake, we picked it up after. We just keep the show moving. They'll forget. When I came to do Mad About You, I was a little worried, you know, because I hadn't learned lines in a long time, and that was the hardest part for me, to learn all these lines, and I really was working. And I got such comfort when I realized we did the first scene and I got through it. I was fine. And then I said, okay, set up, let's do it again. Oh, not my scene, but the scene before me and the scene before that. They did it 2 and 3 times. And I said, what an idea. There was somebody in the audience keeping the audience warmed up. They talked to them, and when I realized that those people, those 200 people, didn't come to see a show. They could see that on television. They came to see how a show is made. And we never thought of it that way. We just thought they came for a show. It's like a free ticket to a show. You know, to go to see Queen for a day, it's a free ticket. You got to give them a show. But what the audience comes to see is how it's done. And to see the human factor. Oh my God, the guy tripped over a thing. The words didn't stick in his mouth right. They bumped into each other. They love that. And then they see it done a second time better, and a third time. Every scene was done at least 2 times and sometimes 3. And it's neater. The neatness is I used to say when we left the show of shows and went into situation comedy, that neatness started to count. In other words, mistakes and fumfers, which we had on the old show, and we didn't have a lot, you know, but you could see it's alive. You could see it's live by attitudes. You can hear audiences laughing. You can see people reacting to real audience laughter. So you knew it was live. Now it was, the 3-camera show was almost live, but it wasn't live exactly because you could stop and repair. So I used to say neatness started to count. Now it really, neatness is imperative. You've got to be neat. But what hasn't changed is writing. The writing has to be good. Yeah. It's terrible to do a neat show on bad writing. Yeah. You know, I always say when we used to do movies that we write a movie, write a scene that's okay, but has big, and everybody was better than the writer. The set decorator, the costumer, the cameraman. Oh, they would put lights into this piece of crap that you wrote. And I say, you feel ashamed. You say, look, their work is much better than mine. That always bothered me, and I think it's one of the reasons I say, well, let's make it a little better, so that we're at least up to the costumer. Where do you get your ideas from? That was one of the best things I ever did for writers when they came into my office. They'd come in with a springboard, and it would be something based on another television show, on an old Lucy or Danny Thomas show, or something they've seen before. And even though I sometimes you can mine your own life just so far, and then you'll remine and you'll repeat yourself. And a question I would ask a writer when he'd come with a springboard that I saw was, wasn't for us, I would say to him, what happened to you in the last week, month, year, something that stands out? Are you married? What stands out in your life with your wife and they'd say, well, I don't know. And believe it or not, they all had something. They never thought it was subject for a television episode. And I would prove, and I'll never forget one guy named Joe Cavella. He said, I don't know. He said, anything funny happened in your life? He says, well, my wife and I were dyeing some curtains, and we were supposed to use a stick, and we put our hands in, and we ended up with black hands. I said, there, we got a show. That's a show. And it was, I'll never forget, it was a perfect example, because there are other ones like that, but that was so clear. And we did a show about, racism. Dick had a Dick was going to get an award for having, done a show based on interracial harmony, and he was going to get an award, and he had his hands were black, so he put gloves. He couldn't figure out what and of course we used that and made it a funny show. But that's always the best thing to do. What has happened to you funny? What have you heard from your friends or your uncle? Somebody must have told you something that really happened. We'll enlarge it, we'll make it bigger than life, and we'll make it funny. But if you give me a really, it'd be twice as funny. If it really happened, if it's a real something that you got emotional about, a fight that you had with your wife on any subject, and we'd look, or just an incident, something that happened that was silly, we'll make a show out of it. That's where you find out if you got a kid who's a writer. You can't just say, you repeat something that happened. Then you have to put it into a form. What do you do with that piece of information? Then you go to, well, what could it be? I mean, let's start again. We'll say people with two dark hands. Immediately we said, it's somebody, we went to that. And we built a show where Dick is, so what do you do with the black hands? It's embarrassing, it doesn't come off. And you get a lot of fun of saying, how the wife got, or the little kid got. He got his hand. Everybody got their hands back, because nobody. Her girlfriend didn't say it was dye. He gave her the dye. So you have a lot of stuff before you get to the end. You have to put things in front of it and and add to the end of it. First, if you have a team where they trust the creative guy, the guy who invented it, they trust that his input will not be negative. In other words, they would come up with something. You can't do that, man. You can't do that. It's funny, but you can't do that. You got to. Sometimes we would bend our characters so much they would almost break, and I would get very upset. There are shows every once in a while I see, and I said, "Oh, Jesus, why did we let that through?" And not many. Maybe out of 158, there are a dozen shows or less that I said, "Oh, we bent them too much. We bent them because he would never get that angry. He'd never do that. He'd never do that." I used to say, "Would I do it?" Because Dick Van Dyke character was me. I said, is it possible that I would do it? Not probable. I go to possible. Is it possible that I would do that? Under given circumstances, I might do that. But if there were circumstances I'd never do that, then I don't do that. It's always better to drive a story with what we call a character-driven story. The character reacts. You make the character so clear to the audience at the beginning. You make it very clear who he is. In a situation comedy, we know how Roseanne's going to act. We know how everybody's going to react because we've seen them 1,000 times. But in a brand new thing, you've got to lay out for the audience how this person reacts. And you can do it very simply. Oh, this guy is an agoraphobic. Because the very first thing, he's walking, he pulls away from the... So you know that when he gets to the edge of the building, he's always going to be frightened. Now you've got an agoraphobic. You know about him. And then you have somebody say to him, hey, we got a date tonight with two girls. Are you kidding? I'm married. What are you? Get out of my way. So you know he's an agoraphobic. You got to tell the audience who the character is, so that anything that happens along the way, you know how he might react to it. And if he reacts against how you built, if an agoraphobic all of a sudden says, "I'll do it, I'll get him," it's wrong. But if he says, I have to get him, you know, I have to help, but I don't know how I can, then he's right. So you tell the audience, you flesh out the characters for the audience, and then if they react the way they're expected to react because of who they are, you trust the piece. You know, it's funny, because you're a producer, you require of writers to give you a step outline. We did in those days. I learned that from Sheldon and his experience with his other shows. That's just to make sure that you're going to get something close to a story. So you'd give them, we never let somebody out of the office with just a springboard. We said, let's develop it, and we developed it together. And if you have somebody, usually the producer of a good television show is also a writer. And if he isn't writing with his hand, he's writing. And you work it out with them. You say, well, here, you don't have anything in, here's one thing I invented. I used to call it a hey may. I didn't invent it, but I called it a hey may. I said, writers, we're very competitive. There's a show opposite and on either side. I want, on our first minute of the show, I want somebody who's sitting and watching the show to say, hey, May, come in here. You should see what they're doing here. He's going to divorce his wife, you know, or whatever. Hey, May. Something that catches the audience. It's done in books, it's done in movies. A movie might be just a partial scene where you say, oh my God, this is beautiful. You've caught me. In a book, it's the first line. You know, I wrote a book last year. I wrote a first line that would catch him. He never realized that hiring a Japanese tutor would have the impact on his marriage that it did. Now you can write, and that's the first line I wrote without having anything in mind. I wrote a whole novel based on that first line. And I said, if you get that hey May, you got them interested. And then the step outline should say, well, what happens in that first scene that's of interest to an audience? And that could also have, if it's a comedy show, that has an element of fun in it. Then what happens? Then Sheldon used to say we have 3 acts. I never thought of it in terms of 3 acts. I thought of a half hour. What happens in that half hour? You tell me where you want the commercials, and we'll find a good, you know, button to put it in. Then you develop 3 segments, the first, second, and third act, and what has to happen in the denouement, the conflict that exists, the denouement, the antithetical views of the main characters, an outside character that's forcing them into a situation that they can't get out of or that they're embarrassed by. There are 7 deadly sins. You forget, you know, envy, all of those things. What has to have one of them? And then you have a show. And now they go with their step outline and they fill it in, they flesh it in. Then you come back and you hold your eyes and say, I hope they did what we talked about or better than we talked about. Most of the time it's not better. They need a second draft, and you talk about, hey, you missed here, you could use this. And if you're a creative producer, you'll not only say, give me something more here. You'll say, you know what's a good idea, what's possible? And you give them 2 possibilities, that this would lead to this, and you see how you can use it at the end. That's what a good producer can do, a writer-producer. But then there are producers who are executive producers who say, need something. That's all right, too. It needs something. And then if you got a creative writer, he'll say, oh, I need something. What do I give it? Because one of the best directions I ever got was from a director who said, give me, you know what you need here? And I was a creative actor writer, and I said, and he was doing this. And I said, and I gave him 4 suggestions. He did that. So you can get people inspired by saying, this is good, but give me something, and they'll give you something if they got it. If they don't have it, then you hire the wrong writer. I don't know what has been written the first time. Maybe Shakespeare, maybe Philip Roth, maybe the great geniuses have been able to not rewrite. It comes out of there. But the rewriting sometimes goes on in a person's head. Sometimes people don't put anything on the paper till it's all in their head, and then it flows out. And they said, I wrote it in 6 weeks. Well, they've been thinking about it for a year. But rewriting, I have never not rewritten. I mean, luckily I learned to use a computer because I type so badly, because my writing was with lines and sketches and black and arrows and then sections pasted up here, put it up. So the computer has helped me do that. But rewriting is the most important thing. If you can write it well the first time, well enough to have it produced, then you're a genius. I think very few writers don't rewrite. We looked at 60 movies, 100 movies for 4 months, 6 months. George Geip and myself sat in a room looking at old movies, looking for two things: the back of somebody's head, and looking for dark backs of the head because we're going to make Steve Martin black, and talking to Charles Lawton, Ingrid Bergman, whoever, and then lines that were coming out. There's a line that's ambiguous and we could use it. And once we had Charles Lawton said, "Listen, Reardon," and so we saw his name's got to be Reardon. And another place, somebody else said, "Hey, Rigby." And so we said, "Oh, his name is Rigby Reardon." So two people calling him by his name. And looking for lines. And now we had, this is like a great jigsaw puzzle, a different kind of writing, but it's also creative writing in that sense. We are given, say, tell a writer, here you are given 35 words to work with. Make a story out of it. You are given, in this case, we're given 100 pieces of short dialogue and some big dialogue. Take that and weave it into another story. It was a cockamamie story we wrote because that's not a good way to write a story. But the gimmick was that he was going to play against old actors that are some deceased. And so that was the gimmick there. So the story didn't have to be as correct as you would need if you weren't that gimmick. When you're writing today, when we were writing in the old show of shows days, we knew, I swear to God, we knew. Mel Tolkien used to say, "Gentlemen, this is a classic. This is a classic," in his Russian accent. And we knew we had something special. And we knew it would stand, some of it would stand the test of time, not all of it, but some of it would. When I did the Van Dyke Show, I knew I had something special. I didn't know what it was exactly. I was pointed out by critics that it's the first time that Danny Thomas did it. We knew what he did for a living. We didn't see him do it that much, but here, half the time he was in his office, half the time he was home, or a third of the time he was in his office, 2/3 home. But we also knew we were doing something special, and I said, when a writer came in with, he's going ape, Splitsville, any kind of jargon of the day, I'd say, no slang, no slang. This has got a potential for a long time acceptance. I says, I think we could rerun with this. Some of these basic premises, life, hate, and I said, let's not date it by saying, when you see old movies, is put down your gat, we've got the ice, but if we say gun and you got the jewels, you're safer. You won't laugh at that. You'll be listening to the story if it's worth listening to. So we were aware then, and I think writers should be aware today. They're not writing for posterity, but write so that when you look at it a few years from now, you don't say, "Oh, geez, I got away with that." Don't get away with anything. Do the best you can for posterity. Think in terms of posterity. It's not going to happen. But if we have any truck with immortality, creative people, writers, actors, directors, have any truck with immortality, it's that we have film, laserdisc, tape. It's there for somebody to see someday. You may be dead, but Adele and Fred Astaire were live for me last night. The Vernon and Irene Castle were live last night, and so were Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And because they were excellent. Excellence will always out. And there's always excellence in our community. Somebody said, "Where's the good stuff?" There's always the same percentage of excellence. It's only 1%, 2%. Try to strive for that. So that someday, years later, like my wife and I sit and watch the Van Dyke Show, and we get letters from 20-year-old kids, who know more trivia than we do. And it was that little extra attention to detail then to make it good, to make it better, not to embarrass ourselves at the moment for the audience. Then that's all we were doing. Those 300 people, we were responsible for making them laugh. If we didn't make them laugh, we didn't do our job. Because we did that, people are laughing today. Everybody who gets into any business should know what came before them. If you want to build a shoe, you got to know how they built shoes years ago, because what happens, everything comes around again. Everything comes around again. And if you're aware of what went before, there are only a certain amount of notes. You have to know the notes to vary the theme. And by the way, everything is fair game. If you see a movie that was done in 1940, Hollywood has known it for years. They revisit the same stories hundreds of times. But if you see something that tickles you, you can't vary the theme if you don't know the theme. You can't dodge the cliche unless you know the cliche. So you better know the best and worst done from history, and you'll be a better writer. You say, oh, that was rotten then, it's rotten today. And you'll pick and choose who to emulate, who to make your hero. And everybody has copied their parents to learn to walk, to learn how to eat with a fork. You do the same thing in show business. Who are your heroes? Those are the ones you emulate. You hear it all the time. They say, boy, Mike Day was, you know, the Marx Brothers, the comedians, Keaton and Chaplin. And we didn't do them, but they're in us. They're in us. And in today's kids, new people are in there. There's Seinfeld and Roseanne and Paul Reiser and all. They're in, you know, look at the good stuff in the past. And sometimes the past is not so distant because there's so much product that comes out that you can't look at the past forever because you'll never get to work.